Hello, my name is Nicola Wilson, and today we'll be discussing freedom, a relative term. To understand freedom, especially in regard to post Civil War, one must look at slavery. What rights were held by slaves? And what rights were held by slave owners? Of course, slave owners owned their slaves. They paid for them, that was their property. That was the way it was during that time period. Slave owners would take care of their slaves um, by giving minimal medical treatment as needed, but the amount of care and taking care given differed depending on owner to owner. It is widely understood that during the Civil War era or pre-Civil War era, there was no freedom for slaves. It wasn't until the Emancipation Proclamation was put into um, effect that slaves were considered free people. Now, it's important to understand what is freedom. It looked different for different people. Nowadays, it might seem like money is freedom, or if you're an immigrant, coming to America is freedom. So, in relation to slaves, or former slaves rather, it is referring to land ownership, being able to protect their family or their kin, freedom of movement, having black owned institutions like schools and churches, access to and participation in the political process, the right to vote. Um, they the freed people wanted to have a say within their community, which they definitely did not have before. Um, Especially when looking at black owned institutions, it wasn't really seen as much as an issue, hindsight wise. The magnitude of the needs of the freed people versus available resources. For instance, churches and schools. Um, when they were slaves, there were no such thing. But now that they are able to establish these institutions, the number of freed people versus the number of resources available outweighed each other greatly. In a letter that Charlotte Fortin wrote, um, she states that she had 140 students in a one-room school. Uh, that is an enormous amount of people to be teaching them, and then to effectively teach them is a whole nother story. When looking at Reconstruction, we look at the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. These amendments are what legally allow freedom to people. The 13th Amendment ending slavery as a race based institution. The 14th Amendment guaranteed the rights of citizenship. Um, State laws could not deny due process or discriminate against particular groups of people. And the 15th Amendment protecting voting rights for men of color. Um, However, especially in the southern part of the country, there were legislation passed on a state by state basis that would still uh, limit freedoms, these new instituted freedoms, um, making it difficult to obtain land, having the process to vote, going to school, um, freedom of movement, so on and so forth. The last federal troops were removed from the southern states in 1877, which pulled out any federal um, involvement in the state's activities. Once this happened, um, sharecropping would occur, putting freed people in a perpetual cycle of debt and poverty, with in contracts with their previous slave owners. Um, in a letter that Jordan Anderson wrote, it really points out the irony and the gall that some slave owners had to allow or offer these jobs for freed people. Um, State laws tried to do whatever they could to take away voting rights through disenfranchisement. Racial violence was occurring through lynching. The Ku Klux Klan was established, and it was a rampant violence all throughout the United States at this time, purely targeted towards Black Americans, freed men and women. Thus started the Jim Crow laws and customs. To have freedom was for Black individuals to have freedom from white people. Black codes essentially criminalized the freedom of Black people, limiting their mobility, and trying to restore antebellum economic order. Segregation laws were put into place to make a social statement and to also legally show freed people where their place should be within the system. Vagrancy laws were put into place where if a freed adult male, did not have employment, then that would be means for arrest. And what would that mean for other freedoms? Freedom of voting, freedom of movement, freedom of owning property. Would there be laws in place to further limit those freedoms? Industrialization occurred in America with the economic boom that allowed increased access to goods, changing the way people lived, increased ease of travel, also changing the way people lived. However, with these increased access to goods or increased ease of travel, there has to be a way to allow access to these items. Now, to have access to them, people would have to be there to offer these items. Who's going to make the bread that is easily accessible? Who's going to man the trains who are increasing travel time? With the Industrial Revolution comes more goods to allow easier life, but at what cost? This showed a huge deficit within labor laws and the means of the working class. What was the working class giving up in place of these easily accessible accommodations? The Gilded Age. It's kind of a satire, play on words. The Gilded Age, meaning falsely gold appearance. Even though it appears as gold and beautiful and shining, when looked upon more closely, is that what it truly is? No, it's not. Captains of industry or robbers of barons, or robber barons rather, were they leading the way for the Industrial Revolution? Were they allowing for more easily access to goods or services or travel, you name it? Or Were they taking all of the money and letting everybody else live in poverty? That is a hugely debated topic. So these captains of industry had huge fortunes that allowed for luxury living, while the average worker, working class, lived in tenement housing that was cramped and not sustainable living. It also led to disease, poverty, several other deplorable conditions. Not only were living conditions deplorable, but so were working conditions. It led to the push for change in protective legislation, whether that be labor laws, regulating laws, so on and so forth. It's important to look at who were the individuals who were at risk for labor abuse. Children, single mothers, those desperate for money. But then again, at what cost? If we look at today's society and how labor laws are, okay, if you have a 40-hour work week, that was not the case back in those times. If children were being forced to work more than overtime by our standards, what does that mean? Is that life? Is that fair? Not necessarily. Not at all. Who was driving this push for change? Civil rights activists, labor activists, populist socialists, and even the captains of industry were doing what they could to bring about reform. So change is driven by what are the wants and needs of the people. If children were being worked in deplorable conditions and deaths were occurring to all workers in unsafe environments, eventually leading to OSHA standards, which saves countless of lives now. But it's important to note where these changes are being driven from. Who was the ones who were raising the red flags to show that change was necessary? People would write books, write articles, journals, so on and so forth, to bring light on what these issues were so that change could come about. Furthermore, women's rights was also a huge movement that was already occurring before this progressivism period. The suffragette women's votes, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments do not mention women whatsoever. Even though the role of women was absolutely necessary during this time or at any time. And then Theodore Roosevelt had developed his Square Deal, which would also go on to allow him to win his presidential election. It's known as the 3 C's: conservationism regarding to natural resources, corporate regulation, and consumer protection. This aimed at helping middle-class citizens and made the formation of the Meat Inspection Act, the Pure Food and Drug Act, which still heavily influences current regulations that exist today. Furthermore, Jacob Riis, who did a lot of studying for urban poverty, realized that people were not just victims of their own doings. It's just issues with systemic problems, and that those systemic problems needed to be brought to light and needed to be brought about to change. So the question I have posed, or is, how did the idea of progressivism bring about change within this new world with new freedoms? Would these progressive ideas have been present before the Reconstruction era? Would they have been present during the Civil War era? It's evident that during slavery, there were not these major progressive acts occurring. While there were people who were shedding light on issues, for instance, Uncle Tom's Cabin by the author is slipping my mind, but the book talks about slavery and how it affects certain things. And that not being the only written works that to help shed light on issues during that time period. However, did this progressive ideas come into place at the right place at the right time? Would these progressive ideas have worked in a previous time? We don't know this. And therefore, I think freedom is a relative idea. When slaves obtained their freedom, was it replaced with new constrictions? Yes, definitely. The Industrial Revolution occurred, allowing people to live closer to each other, not do as much farming, live more of a urban lifestyle. Did it come with restrictions? Definitely. But just because freedoms were obtained, that doesn't mean that all freedoms were fixed, or all restrictions were fixed, rather. It's just, let's replace these previous restrictions with different ones. And now that freedom has been established and people know what they wanted, now they knew what to do, that we need to do whatever we can to establish these newfound freedoms and to keep them in place. Here's a list of references used for this presentation. Thank you for your time. Have a good one. Bye.